So, a very good morning. We are going to be talking about cybersecurity this morning. Thanks for joining us. We have a very distinguished panel to do so. And let me just briefly say a few words about this year and cybersecurity, because we can have the impression that we live in times of cyber insecurity. It has been a remarkable year. Again, we have to say, in May we had WannaCry, the biggest, as Europol put it, cyber attack to date, affecting 200,000 computers, more than 200,000 computers worldwide in more than 150 countries. Only several weeks later, we had NotPetya, again an international cyber attack spreading from Ukraine. Only a couple of weeks ago, we learned that actually any of you who had been using Yahoo back in 2013 were a potential target and a potential victim of a breach, because other than Yahoo stated beforehand, it was not only 1 billion accounts breached, but every Yahoo account in 2013. And then just to show you the shadowy and murky world of cybersecurity, one of the more interesting stories just a couple of weeks ago really was about this brand you all know, this Russian brand of AV, antivirus company. You all know the name, I guess, that actually was used obviously as a kind of search engine for interesting documents, top secret documents, classified documents, mostly of US intelligence. On the computers it has been installed worldwide, and it has been installed in 3 figures of the millions worldwide. But that's not the only interesting thing. The more interesting thing even is how that came to light, because actually Kaspersky, the company, had been infiltrated by the Israelis beforehand, and they watched the Russian intelligence using AV software from Kaspersky, spying on other computers, spying for other intelligence. So, just to give you a very brief introduction in this world, and now we're trying to talk about how to tackle this. We won't do a big introduction because we have a very distinguished panelists. It would take us a lot of time. You can read all of it in your material. Perhaps we start with Urmas here right next to me, because he's a member of parliament, of the European Parliament right now, but he has been foreign secretary of Estonia 10 years ago. And as you might remember, Estonia is one of the first victims, has been one of the first victims of the so-called cyber war. And Urmas, perhaps you can tell us how it feels to be targeted, because you yourself have been targeted as well. One of your phone calls is online, basically, because it has been intercepted. And what Estonia learned from being a victim.
Yeah, well, good morning. 2007 spring, Estonia was under massive cyber attacks. And of course, it was for us something really new. It seemed to be really dangerous, because not only public offices and websites were under attack, but also banks and some other important institutions. I'm glad that we managed 2007, and I'm also glad that it was some sort of wake-up call for all Europe, because after it, I guess more and more European countries took this threat really seriously, started to establish also different structures, how to combat cyber attacks, how to be ready for increased level of cybersecurity. And in Estonia, NATO's Center for Cyber Defense was established. And now, as we all know, cyber security, cyber defense is everywhere. It's in NATO, it's in the EU, it's in important part also of NATO and EU cooperation. So that really we may say that this attack, I put like this, it was most of people like out of blue, now is our, everyday's life and part of our everyday's life.
But this actually brings us perfectly to Sir Julian. He's the commissioner, the European Commissioner for the Security Union. That sounds actually pretty good. It sounds as if the lesson had been learned and that we are in a safe place in the European Union. Actually, if we read the news, we can't have that feeling. Where are we when it comes to the state of cybersecurity?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to say that we were safe. There are 4,000 ransomware attacks happening every day. We have 2 billion sets of personal data of European citizens hacked last year. So I think it would be a mistake to say that we were safe. But we are trying to do more to increase our resilience, to make ourselves a harder target, to build deterrence, i.e. to dissuade people from coming after us. There's a military element to that, but there's a very big civil element to that, law enforcement, making it easier to trace and hold people to account for their attacks, and to boost international cooperation, because it's important that we're building better systems across Europe. But let's face it, this is an international challenge, and to make real progress, we're going to have to work with partners internationally, countries and partners who think a little bit like we do. But I think a real challenge is, what are we going to do with partners who might not approach these questions in exactly the same way as we would? So there's still loads of work to do on this.
And there are many, as we will see perhaps later on. But let me first come to Bryan, because on the panel we have entrepreneurs, we have politicians, and we want to talk about collaborative efforts for protection, for better protection. Bryan, you were in the business, you founded Braintree, sold that to PayPal, so you were in the business of online and mobile payment, which is of course very sensitive when it comes to cybersecurity. Now perhaps you're in an even more sensitive business, because if I may say so, you want to hack the brain with Kernel, your new venture. You want to improve brain function, putting human intelligence and AI together, enhance the human brain. And you want to do that via implants. And when I hear implants in my brain and think of cybersecurity, I get a little bit scared.
Right.
So perhaps you can help us with your perspective.
Yeah, I think if we look at all the crime that's happened around the world, the one thing they all have in common is humans. It's people doing things to other people. And the way I think about it is that the structure we have in society today, where a central government or authority says, hey, everybody, we'll keep you safe. Like, go about your affairs, go to conferences, go to restaurants, go to your social events, and we've got you. And then we go somewhere, and we get shot up, or we get held ransom, and we say, what happened? I thought you were keeping me safe. And so I think this contract we have with our central authorities needs to be reconfigured. And specifically, I think that the idea that a central authority can keep a population safe is insane. It just will never work. And now that humans have the ability to do increasingly damaging things with more destruction, it's not something we as a species can tolerate. We cannot afford individuals to be doing these things. So for example, one application of what we're building at Kernel is if we can build these brain interfaces that actually extend human cognition. And they were able to, let's imagine a case where they would have access to your thoughts, your imaginations, your intentions, your secrets, everything about you. That's really sensitive information. And so the question is, what would you want to do with that? What I think I personally would not want to do with that is make it broadly available to the world. I think it would be a better idea to create some type of secure infrastructure, for example, like building something in the blockchain, where you could drop the neural data in the blockchain, where each person is then represented by a technological structure. If that were the case, each of us had this representation where we had data security privacy as a human right. And so let's say, for example, I wanted to come into Web Summit and say, could I please come to the conference? They could have a security algorithm that would hit my blockchain and ask all kinds of questions. Am I safe to come here? My social history, my interaction history, my neural data, et cetera, et cetera. They wouldn't get access to the raw data. They just simply get access to yes, no questions. And if I pass the security threshold, I can walk into the conference. But it's ideas like this. And they need to, of course, need a lot of vetting, and there's a lot of development needs to be done. But I think that is the only way we as a society can structure security going forward that's actually going to succeed. Otherwise, I think we create too much risk for the species of single individuals or groups of individuals carrying out massive levels of damage to society.
No?
There we go.
Yeah, we're on.
Hello?
No.
That would be a complete new model, and we're already coming to possible solutions. But perhaps we stay with the problems for a second longer with Gal, because we were talking about the different levels of coordinating cybersecurity. And if you see the nation state, and I think that's difficult enough to coordinate private companies who run a big a big chunk of the critical infrastructure, and national governments and their interests. We saw that last year with Apple versus FBI. We saw this year with Microsoft criticizing the US after the WannaCry campaign, because WannaCry actually made use of a zero-day exploit that was stolen from the NSA, from their own agency, so to speak, government agency. So what are your thoughts, Gal? You're wearing two hats. You're with a think tank in Washington, D.C., and you're also an entrepreneur because you're with a fintech and other companies in Switzerland. What's your perspective on this difficult relationship?
I think first we need to understand that we are in the midst of perhaps the biggest war of our time. And this war is not between countries, the way that we have been accustomed to look at wars. The big conflict of our time is what I call the establishment versus the anti-establishment. It lends itself to almost every aspect of our life, whether it is banking and finance, cryptocurrencies versus traditional bankers, intelligence, the Snowdens and the WikiLeaks versus NSA and CIA. It lends itself to of course, the internet is the biggest battleground of all. And that's why we see all of these things happening, because a lot of folks are trying to use this not as a way to make money or launch terror attacks, really because they want to challenge the establishment that they don't like. I mean, what is Donald Trump is all about? It's about a rebellion against the establishment. And this rebellion is going to increase and increase and increase, and it will all come to a head on this platform that we created called the internet. And the reason it is because the biggest flaw of the internet today is the anonymity factor. Internet was not designed to be the way it is today. Internet is not a place where people talk to people. It's a place where machines talk to machines. And unless we differentiate between the machines and the people, or find a way to authenticate the users, no government in the world will be able to improve our security. And no collaboration platform will be able to improve our security. Yes, it will cost more and more money because we'll have to pay more and more for security, add more and more layers. It will be a whole internet industrial complex that will thrive. A lot of rent seekers will gather around to suck a lot of our taxpayers' money to improve our security. There will be mass surveillance and all this. But are we going to be more secure? No, we will not, unless we find a way to authenticate and to overcome this anonymity issue. And I'm saying, what I'm suggesting here is to create a voluntary disclosure in which people who are not criminals, not hackers, good people, hardworking taxpayers, tax-paying people, and they come forward and say, here is who I am. And in exchange, I'm getting encryption and I'm getting privacy. And this is a grand bargain that governments need to have with the people. And if I'm willing to self-identify myself, we call it, by the way, the white web society, which is a contrast to the dark web. If we have this, then it will not improve for everybody, but at least for those people who are willing to self-identify themselves, to create an internet in which, for the first time, people talk to people and not machines talk to machines.
So that is, of course, an idea that has been politically discussed as well in the last couple of years, the end of anonymity discussion. How do you see that as a member of the European Parliament? Is that a possible solution that came via, I think it's an NGO you have in Switzerland with the wide web?
Yeah, well, in general terms, of course, there are two very big issues or big problems related to cyber crimes and cybersecurity. First, it's legal environment. Well, there have been also proposals to create some sort of special international law for internet and for all cyber life and cyber world. But I guess it's not realistic. We have so-called Tallinn Manual 2.0, which gives around 160 concrete proposals and suggestions for lawyers in all around the world. And the frame is that the present international law should also apply for online, for internet world. Because if you look at the scope of the crimes, also the outcome of the crimes, where also, well, the lives may be in danger, then there is actually no difference between online and offline. So that one is this legal environment. And second issue is impunity. Today, majority of cyber criminals, they are not facing any charges, any punishment. So that this is second sphere where actually the governments who are ready to do this have to be much more serious, much more concrete on this, finding out who is behind, who are the criminals. Because this sense that this anonymity will continue anyway, of course. I agree that then we will not see any real difference in immediate future.
But don't have governments actually, and the EU as well, a problem of credibility and trust here? Because on the one hand, governments are, since several years now, building up cyber defense. There are new authorities, much more staff, much money spent on cyber defense. On the other hand, we hear from government agencies that they need the possibility to crack encryption, that they need backdoors, that they fear that there's a going dark, and they're stockpiling basically vulnerabilities that make the internet more insecure, as WannaCry has shown, if those vulnerabilities leak in one way or the other. Isn't that a big problem of credibility, and shouldn't governments refrain from stockpiling those vulnerabilities?
Well, I'll come to that particular point in a moment, but I do think, as our title is about collaboration, that it's worth just noting that we are making progress on a collaborative approach on a number of these issues. We're getting cooperation now across all sorts of boundaries, across borders, obviously, certainly in Europe, and increasingly with some international partners, but also between civil and authorities, including sometimes defense authorities, and I think it's important to talk about that. But most importantly for me, between the public and the private sectors, because we're only going to make progress if we can build collaboration there. Most of what we're talking about is civilian, and most of that is private sector. So the idea that somehow states are able to solve this problem on their own seems to me to be completely unrealistic. It's only going to be able to, we're only collectively going to be able to make progress if we build that really effective public-private collaboration. I'm very proud of the fact that in Europe we've managed to mobilize a public-private partnership for cybersecurity research that's going to generate 1.8 billion euros worth of research investment in the next couple of years. I think that's great. But in the United States, they're spending $17 billion this year alone on research into these issues. So what we're managing to do in Europe is not yet at the kind of scale that we need. We're only going to be able to make further progress if we have this public-private cooperation, because I'm sorry, there's no governments, there's no money tree in Brussels that's going to be able to generate the amount of finance and the amount of targeted research that is necessary.
Would you mind coming back to my question?
I'm not trying to dodge your question.
Because you mentioned that trust is needed between private companies and governments. And actually, what was I just rephrasing was Microsoft's position after WannaCry, that WannaCry has been a wake-up call. Something has gone out of control. Intelligence agencies no longer obviously are able to keep their secrets and their zero-day exploits and vulnerabilities.
So something in this debate is about the role of state authorities And certainly from the Commission's point of view, we're not asking anybody to create deliberately vulnerabilities. We've said very clearly that we don't think systemic vulnerabilities are for the general good because they weaken the overall systemic security. We're not at all close to having a discussion about how, if researchers or others discover vulnerabilities, they might share that information. We think all of that is work that we should pursue. But on the other hand, we also think that we need to work with the private sector, with the big companies and the big platforms to see how, in a sense, we can develop corporate social responsibility for the cyber age. So in the case of the WannaCry attack, many of the people were hit because they were using an old Microsoft Windows system, for which it was possible to continue to get updates if you paid quite a lot of money. So we think we need to have a discussion with the private sector about whether that model, that old model of selling systems that become quite quickly redundant and then it being very complicated and very costly to get updates and patches is really what we need now, given the scale of the threat, or whether we need a different kind of model, where if you buy a car, you can run it into the ground or you can trade it in sometimes for a newer model. Maybe we need that kind of thinking applied so that it's not just about states taking responsibility for being open and responsible. It's about the private sector as well, helping us to build collectively our cybersecurity and resilience.
Yeah. Switching from this collaboration between the private sector and national governments to the more international level. I mean, there have been calls for a NATO of the net. There have been calls for a digital Geneva Convention. How optimistic are you, Gail, perhaps? How optimistic are you that actually international governments, the important players, so China, Russia, the US, Israel, the country you're from, come to one table and actually discuss those topics and come to a positive conclusion? How optimistic are you?
Well, it makes for a great topic for conversation and research and think tank stuff. But in the real world, it's meaningless because in the end, NATO was a bunch of countries cooperating against another country. Here, as I said before, the game that we are playing now is not countries versus countries, or it's about internal conversations. It's about government versus its own people. It's about what we call internet citizenship. The borders are now becoming increasingly blurred. And I think that the biggest test case of this is the whole issue of encryption and backdoors, because this is where it all comes to a head. The FBI has an interest in 6,000 or 7,000 cell phones. And what they're saying is basically that Apple needs to compromise 2 billion people so they can have access to 7,000 phones. This is unacceptable. This will bring to a point in which more and more users will drift to open source platforms, because only an open source platform you can protect yourself, quite frankly. And that will mean that entrepreneurs will also have to shift to the open source world. And I think this is I love cooperation, and I think it's great to talk about it, find ways where we can sort of figure out a way and do the private-public efforts. But in the end, there is a big elephant in the room, and that is, do I let the government into my code? Because it's not only Brussels, it's not only Washington, it's Beijing. If you know, for example, the new cybersecurity law that China recently passed, just take a look at it and tell me how you feel that entrepreneurs could live with something like this. So I just don't see a way that these things can be resolved. And therefore, I think what will happen, the pressure will mount, and more users will move to the open source, because that's, quite frankly, yeah, it's open, but it's the only way I can protect myself.
Perhaps Urmas wanted to react quickly, please, because I had another question for Bryan.
Yes, I I just wanted to add that it's still also the issue for state-to-state conflicts, because during last years there has been no conventional conflict between the states without the elements of cyber attacks and cyber conflict as well. So that I put it like this, that today also cyber attacks and cyber war is part of conventional wars. And what concerns international environment, I'm absolutely pessimistic. I don't see any chance for real agreement what concerns the legal order for cyber crimes and cyber wars in the world. If to look at the positions, one side, European Union, European countries, United States, few others, and then the countries like China, North Korea, Russia, many others, then I don't see here any real possibility to have some sort of international agreement or so-called new Geneva Convention on this. So that in this regard, I guess that it's important and it's doable, much more cooperation among European countries, for example, or together US and Europe. But if we have global picture, then it looks really, really sad at the moment.
Bryan, as the tech guy on the panel, we've learned that basically technology can achieve anything. We've learned that from the Silicon Valley. Is there technological or are there technological solutions for better cybersecurity?
I guess I'd approach that question. I would imagine that this panel could have been done millions of times throughout the history of humanity. Going back to all the challenges they face at any given time. Humans have gone from hitting each other over the head with rocks, to shooting each other with guns, to sabotaging each other on the internet. It's a consistent theme of human behavior, of what it is to be human, individuals and our systems. And when we talk about this, we're talking about human systems and individual behavior. And whether we like this topic or not, we are now entering into an age where we are able to read and write the systems that make us up. So for example, our ability to sequence the genome at low cost and have tools like CRISPR and Cas9 to edit our genome. And we can ask questions around fertility and disease and dysfunction and improvement. The same is true with neural code, where we have increasingly better tools to read and write to our brain. These questions are uncomfortable and they have historical baggage, but they bring up the fundamental question of how we're going to evolve as a species. And in that evolution of the species, we have this contemplation of how we cooperate together to be safe and secure so we don't achieve undesired outcomes. Now we have to, of course, merge a whole bunch of opinions, in this case, because we are a grand society. But I think that in these conversations, I hear the discussions of this, but I think it's very high level, top level, how we're doing it. But to me, it's not at the root of the challenge. It's not the root, which is humans. We're doing this to each other, and I don't know how it's always a staying one step behind or ahead on this back and forth. And when I think about the future of the human race in 20, 40, 100 years from now, and I look at the scale in which human ability has flatlined, my immediate attention goes to the single most relevant thing we could do as a species would be working on our cognitive evolution. Now, also in the case, this is something we need to have a tremendous amount of thoughtfulness and carefulness, because it's a delicate thing. We must do well. But to me, I don't find a ton of I don't find it worthy of my attention specifically to focus on these top level things. I want to go to the root and figure out how we might succeed 50, 100, 200 years down the road.
So we've heard that there are many voices that call for a Geneva digital convention. If we would, because we have only 4 minutes left, trying to write a Lisbon digital convention, and only pinpoint 3 or 4 major points, everybody, for you, for a better collaboratory cybersecurity policy, what would it be? Perhaps you start, Urmas?
Well, I once again like to advert this Tallinn manual to look at this document. There are 160 plus, I guess, very relevant suggestions for every and each country in the world. And it is all in the frame that there is no difference today from this point of view between offline and online. This international law, human rights, all this stuff is also very relevant for online world. That's it.
Yeah.
I would say just enable gated communities within the internet. Differentiate the internet. Create, if you want, a business class type environment within the current internet where people can have a different bargain. And you will not be able to fix everything, but at least you'll be able to free the mainstream people, the decent people. Not everybody is a terrorist. Not everybody needs to be treated as one. And that will at least solve the problem for some people who deserve it more than others.
Yeah, I would say there's two challenges. One is social, one is technology. So we are enabled by our tools. We're also limited by our tools. So ideas such as this that we could certainly explore implementing, we need to figure out what the technological tools are. And so maybe it's going to come from the research that various nation states are doing, but we inherently need to construct technological tools that enable the option. And then we need to figure out the social cooperation to say, now how do we do it? Because technology, I am not a technology utopist. I think that technology can go either way. They just enable possibilities. And so I think that we need greater enabled possibilities for better security, but the social cooperation is the foundation for how we get that tied up.
I think we've heard some very interesting, quite challenging visions for the future, but we also have to deal with this problem now, because cybercrime is growing exponentially because it's too easy, and it's not just criminals. There are non-state and state actors who are getting engaged in this. They're not just going after money, they're going after our democratic processes and our democratic institutions. So for me, this is a problem, notwithstanding the need to think about it long term, that we need to tackle right now, and we need to build our resilience. There's some very practical things we can do on that, and some of that is about individuals' behavior, but a lot of it is about organizations and organizational behavior, and it's about getting our platforms and our devices integrating security from the very start. We have to build deterrence, which means we have to make it harder to get away with attacks, which means increased transparency and traceability. Some very challenging questions then about the architecture of the internet, which at the moment makes it too easy to hide and obscure what you're doing. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but we'll have to address that question, and we need to build cooperation. For me, as important as the international cooperation is the absolutely crucial cooperation between states and the private sector, because we will only make progress if we're working together.
Okay. I hope you feel a little bit safer now after this discussion. You do not. Perhaps a little bit more afraid after what you've heard. Thank you very much for your ideas. Thank you very much for joining and being here. Thank you.